Her gambling father staked her life on a hand of poker and lost her to a Sioux chief to settle his debts. But that chief would love her more fiercely than any man ever could. The saloon reeked of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and broken dreams as 21-year-old Amelia Amy Hartford pressed her ear against the thin wooden wall separating her tiny room from the poker den below. The sound that drifted up through the floorboards made her blood run cold. Her father's voice, thick with desperation, slurring words that would seal her fate forever. "I'll stake my daughter against the debt. She's worth more than gold. I swear it on my mother's grave." The very air seemed to thicken with dread as Amy realized that 3 years of watching her father's descent into gambling madness had led to this moment. She had always feared this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made her knees buckle with terror.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Amy's hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white against the chipped paint that told the story of countless desperate souls who had occupied this miserable room before her. For 3 years, she had watched her father, Thomas Hartford, spiral deeper into the gambling addiction that had already cost them their farm in Missouri, their covered wagon, their oxen, and every last piece of her mother's precious jewelry. The only tangible memories she had left of the woman who had died bringing her into this harsh world. Now in this godforsaken mining town where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card, where desperate men sold their souls for one more chance at striking it rich, he was about to gamble away the only thing he had left, his own daughter. The irony wasn't lost on Amy that her father, who had once been a respected farmer and church deacon back in Missouri, was now preparing to trade his flesh and blood like a head of cattle. The voices below grew louder, more heated, and Amy recognized the cold, calculating tone of Jeremiah Black Iron Vasquez, the most feared man in Deadwood and quite possibly the entire Dakota Territory. Vasquez owned half the gambling houses, 3 brothels, the largest general store, and had more blood on his hands than the territorial hangman who worked overtime in this lawless frontier town. Men whispered that he had killed his first man at 14 and hadn't stopped counting since. Her father owed him nearly $2,000, a fortune that might as well have been $2 million for all the chance Thomas had of paying it back, especially considering his luck at cards had been consistently disastrous for months. The debt had been growing like a cancer, compounding with interest that Vasquez calculated with the precision of a banker and the ruthlessness of a wolf. Amy had heard the threats, seen the bruises on her father's face when Vasquez's enforcers came calling, and watched her father's hands shake with fear every time someone knocked on their door. "Your daughter, you say?" Vasquez's voice carried up through the floorboards like smoke from hell itself, each word dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that made strong men wet themselves. "And what makes you think a broken-down drunk's girl is worth my time? I've seen her. Pretty enough, I'll grant you. But she's got that defiant look in her eyes, the same fire that burned in her mother's stare, the kind that causes trouble." Amy could picture Vasquez's scarred face, the jagged line that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight that had left his opponent in the town cemetery. His reputation for violence was matched only by his reputation for finding creative ways to collect debts, and Amy had heard whispered stories about what happened to people who couldn't pay what they owed. Amy's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard her father's chair scrape against the floor with the tortured sound of wood against wood that seemed to echo the torment in his soul. Through a crack in the floorboards, she could see him swaying on his feet, his once proud shoulders now bent with shame and desperation, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had grown gaunt from too much whiskey and too little food. "She's educated, can read and write better than most men in this territory, speaks a little French that her mother taught her, and knows numbers better than half the bookkeepers in town. She's strong, works harder than any 3 ranch hands, And she's got her mother's beauty and her grandmother's fire. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, and Amy could see tears glistening on his stubbled cheeks in the lamplight. This was the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the cornfields of their Missouri farm, who had taught her to read using his own father's Bible, who had promised her mother on her deathbed that he would always protect their daughter. "Education don't warm a man's bed," came a rough voice Amy didn't recognize, followed by the sound of someone spitting tobacco juice into a spittoon. "And fire in a woman just means she'll burn you when you ain't looking. I've seen enough spirited fillies broken to saddle to know that the pretty ones always cause the most trouble." The voice belonged to one of Vasquez's regular customers, a man Amy had seen around town, a grizzled prospector named Silas, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite and 2 wives to consumption, and who spent his evenings drinking away whatever gold dust he managed to scratch from the unforgiving earth. The room erupted in harsh laughter that sounded like the cackling of carrion birds fighting over roadkill, but Vasquez's voice cut through it like a blade through silk. "Quiet, I'm thinking. 2,000 is a lot of money, Hartford. More than most men see in a lifetime out here. More than your girl's worth to me, no matter how pretty or educated she might be. I've got girls aplenty already, and adding another mouth to feed ain't exactly profitable." Amy could hear the calculation in his voice, the cold mathematics of a man who weighed human lives against gold coins and found the exchange rate wanting. But there was something else in his tone, a hint of interest that made her stomach churn with dread. Amy's stomach lurched as she heard the desperation creeping into her father's voice like poison seeping into a well. "Please, Jeremiah, I've got nowhere else to turn, no other cards to play. Give me one more chance, one last hand to make this right. If I win, we're even, clean slate, no more debt between us. If I lose," his voice broke like a dam bursting, "she's yours to do with as you see fit." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Amy felt something die inside her chest, the last flickering ember of faith she had harbored that her father might somehow find the strength to protect her. She had known this moment might come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that no amount of mental preparation could have readied her for. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, punctuated only by the distant sound of piano music from the main saloon and the occasional burst of drunken laughter from the street outside. Amy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a war drum, could taste the copper of fear on her tongue, could feel cold sweat beating on her forehead, despite the oppressive heat of the August evening. Finally Vasquez spoke, and his words chilled her to the bone like a blast of Arctic wind. "One hand, 5-card draw, no wild cards, no second chances. But if you lose, Hartford, she don't just work off your debt in my establishment. She becomes my property, to do with as I see fit. And we both know what kind of business I run upstairs." The threat was clear as mountain spring water. If her father lost this hand, Amy would join the ranks of the hollow-eyed women who serviced Vasquez's customers, trapped in a life of degradation and despair with no hope of escape. Amy bit her knuckle to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. She had seen the girls who worked for Vasquez, hollow-eyed women who flinched at sudden movements and never smiled except when they were paid to. Women who had once been daughters and sweethearts before circumstances or desperation had delivered them into his hands. Some had been widows with no other means of survival. Others had been abandoned by families who couldn't afford to feed them. And still others had simply made the mistake of owing Vasquez money they couldn't repay. The thought of joining their ranks, of becoming just another piece of property in Vasquez's collection, made bile rise in her throat and her vision blur with tears of rage and terror. "Deal the cards," her father whispered. And Amy heard the sound of his soul breaking in those 3 simple words. Amy pressed her face against the crack in the floor, watching as 5 cards were dealt to each man with the ritualistic precision of a funeral ceremony.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The lamplight flickered and danced across the green felt table, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. Her father's hands shook as he picked up his cards, and she saw his face go pale as milk in the lamplight. Beads of sweat forming on his brow like dewdrops on morning grass. Across the table, Vasquez sat motionless as a coiled rattlesnake, his dark eyes never leaving her father's face, reading every twitch and tremor like a book written in the language of desperation. The other men around the table had grown quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple card game. They were watching a man sell his daughter's soul to the devil. The betting began small, $50, then doubled again as the two men stared at each other across the felt-covered battlefield, where Amy's fate would be decided. Amy watched in horror as her father threw good money after bad, his desperation making him reckless in a way that would have been obvious to a child, let alone an experienced gambler like Vasquez. She wanted to scream, to burst through the floor and slap the cards from his hands, to shake him until he came to his senses and realized what he was about to lose. But she was trapped in her room above the saloon, forced to watch helplessly, as her father gambled away her freedom, her future, and quite possibly her life. When the final cards were drawn and the hands revealed, she didn't need to see the cards to know what had happened. Her father's anguished sob told her everything she needed to know. 3 queens, Vasquez said quietly, laying his cards on the table with deliberate precision, each card hitting the felt with the finality of a coffin nail being driven home. Beats your pair of jacks by a considerable margin. His voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction, just the cold professionalism of a businessman completing a transaction. Thomas Hartford's head fell into his hands, and Amy heard him begin to weep, deep, broken sobs that echoed through the saloon like the death rattle of a dying man. The sound cut through her heart like a rusty blade, each sob a fresh wound that would never heal. But it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her when she heard Vasquez's next words, spoken with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Send word to Chief Mato Tonka in the Black Hills. Tell him I have something that might interest him more than my usual offerings. Something special. The words hit Amy like a physical blow, and she felt her world tilt sideways as the meaning sank in. She had heard whispers about Mato Tonka, the young Sioux chief who had been raiding supply trains and terrorizing settlers. Along the Cheyenne River, Vasquez wasn't planning to keep her for his brothel. He was planning to trade her to the Indians. Like a piece of merchandise, Amy's world tilted sideways as the meaning of those words sank in like poison into her bloodstream. She had heard whispers about Mato Tonka, the young Sioux chief who had been raiding supply trains and terrorizing settlers along the Cheyenne River with a precision and ruthlessness that had made him a legend throughout the territory. Some said he was a savage who collected scalps like other men collected coins, decorating his lodge with the hair of his enemies. Others claimed he was a brilliant tactician who had studied at mission schools before returning to his people, a man who spoke perfect English and understood the white man's ways well enough to use them against him. All agreed on one thing: he was the most dangerous man in the Dakota Territory, a warrior who had never lost a battle against the U.S. Army, and who commanded the loyalty of hundreds of braves who would die at his word. The thought of being delivered to such a man, of becoming his property to do with as he pleased, made Amy's blood turn to ice water in her veins. "You can't be serious," one of the other gamblers stammered, his voice high with shock and disbelief. "Trade a white woman to them savages? That's as good as signing her death warrant. Hell, it might be kinder to just put a bullet in her head right here and now." The man's face had gone pale beneath his beard, and Amy could see his hands shaking as he reached for his whiskey glass. Even hardened frontier men who had seen their share of violence and cruelty were appalled by what Vasquez was proposing. Vasquez's laugh was cold as winter wind across the prairie, devoid of any human warmth or compassion. Madotanka has particular tastes, and he pays well for them, better than gold sometimes. An educated white woman will fetch me more than enough to cover Hartford's debt, with a tidy profit besides. And if she don't survive the arrangement, well, that ain't my concern now, is it? His voice carried the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock, and Amy realized with crystal clarity that to him, that's exactly what she had become. A commodity to be bought and sold, no different from a horse or a cow. The revelation filled her with a rage so pure and hot that it temporarily burned away her fear. Amy's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees on the rough wooden floor, her whole body shaking with terror and rage so intense. It felt like being struck by lightning. This couldn't be happening. Her father couldn't have just condemned her to a fate worse than death for the sake of a poker hand, couldn't have traded away his own flesh and blood like a piece of property. But even as she tried to deny it, tried to convince herself that this was all some horrible nightmare from which she would soon wake, she heard Vasquez giving orders to his men in the tone of a man who had done this sort of thing before. Saddle up at first light. We ride to the chief's winter camp in 3 days' time. And make sure the girl is cleaned up and presentable when we deliver her. Madotanka don't pay full price for damaged goods, and I intend to collect every penny this transaction is worth. The next few hours passed in a haze of nightmare and disbelief that felt like drowning in molasses. Amy tried to run, but Vasquez's men had been expecting that. They grabbed her before she could make it to the back door, their rough hands bruising her arms as they dragged her back upstairs like a sack of grain. She screamed for her father, begged him to reconsider, offered to work in Vasquez's establishment rather than be traded away, like livestock to a man who might torture her for sport. But Thomas Hartford couldn't even look at her. Shame and whiskey, having robbed him of whatever backbone he once possessed. He sat slumped in his chair like a broken marionette, staring at the cards scattered across the table as if they might somehow rearrange themselves and change the outcome of the game. Please, Papa, Amy whispered through her tears as they tied her hands behind her back with rough hemp rope that cut into her wrists. Please don't let them take me. I'll find another way to pay the debt. I'll work day and night. I'll scrub floors. I'll do anything. Just don't let them trade me away. Like some kind of animal. Her voice broke on the words, and she could taste salt and desperation on her lips. This was the man who had once read her bedtime stories, who had taught her to ride a horse and milk a cow, who had promised her that no harm would ever come to her as long as he drew breath. Her father's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper carried on breath that reeked of whiskey and defeat. I'm sorry, Amy. I'm so goddamn sorry. But it's done now. The deal is struck, and Vasquez ain't the kind of man who goes back on his word. Maybe the chief will be kinder than Vasquez would have been. Maybe he'll treat you decent, like a wife instead of a... He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't bring himself to speak aloud what they both knew Vasquez had planned for her. Amy stared at him in disbelief, seeing clearly for the first time the broken, pathetic man her father had become, a shadow of the strong, principled farmer who had once commanded respect throughout their Missouri community. You're a coward, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, each word sharp as a knife blade. Mama would be ashamed of what you've become, ashamed of what you've done to her daughter. And I'll never forgive you for this. Never, not if. I lived to be 100 years old. The blow came so suddenly she didn't see it coming. Vasquez backhanded her across the face with a force that split her lip and sent stars exploding across her vision like the 4th of July. Keep your mouth shut, girl. From now on, you speak when spoken to, and not before. You belong to me until I hand you over to the chief, and I don't tolerate disrespect from my property. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than threatening a young woman's life. Amy tasted blood on her tongue, metallic and warm, but she forced herself to meet Vasquez's cold stare without flinching. If she was going to die in the wilderness at the hands of a Sioux war chief, she would at least face her fate with dignity intact. It was something her father had proven incapable of doing, but she would not follow his example into cowardice. And shame dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound of horses being saddled and the rough voices of Vasquez's men preparing for the journey that would take Amy away from everything she had ever known. Amy had spent the night tied to a chair, unable to sleep, her mind racing through desperate plans of escape that all seemed hopeless given the vast wilderness that surrounded Deadwood. When they finally untied her and shoved a plate of beans and hardtack in front of her, she forced herself to eat despite her churning stomach. She would need her strength for whatever lay ahead, and she refused to give Vasquez the satisfaction of seeing her waste away from despair. The ride into Sioux territory was a 3-day nightmare of dust, heat, and constant fear that stretched Amy's nerves to the breaking point. Vasquez's men treated her like cargo, speaking over her head as if she couldn't understand their crude comments about what the chief might do with his new gift. They rode hard from dawn to dusk, stopping only when the horses needed rest, and Amy's whole body ached from the unfamiliar motion of horseback travel. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing dread as they rode deeper into the Black Hills, where every shadow might hide a war party and every ridge might be her last glimpse of the civilized world. The landscape grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile, but Amy could find no comfort in its beauty when she knew it might soon become her grave on the afternoon of the 3rd day. They crested a rise and saw smoke in the distance, cooking fires of a Sioux winter camp that seemed to sprawl across the valley like a small city. Amy's heart hammered against her ribs as she counted the teepees spread across the valley below, dozens of them, housing what must have been hundreds of warriors and their families. She was one white woman about to be delivered into the heart of enemy territory, with no hope of rescue and no way to escape. The finality of her situation hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip the saddle horn to keep from falling from her horse. "There she is," Vasquez said with satisfaction. That sounded obscene in the wilderness air. "The winter camp of Chief Matotanka. Time to see if our journey was worth the trouble." His voice carried the anticipation of a man about to close a profitable business deal, and Amy realized that her terror and despair meant nothing to him beyond their potential impact on the price he might receive. As they rode down into the valley, Amy caught her first glimpse of the man who now owned her. Chief Matotanka stood tall and straight beside the largest teepee, his long black hair adorned with eagle feathers and his powerful frame wrapped in buffalo robes that spoke of both status and practical warmth. Even from a distance, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes and the quiet authority with which he held himself as he watched their approach. This was no savage, this was a leader of men, a warrior who commanded respect through strength and wisdom rather than fear. Alone. But that realization brought Amy no comfort, for she knew that intelligence could be as dangerous as savagery. When it came to the fate of a captive, when Vasquez dismounted and approached the chief, Amy found herself studying Matotanka's face, searching for some clue about her fate in the planes and angles of his features. His expression was unreadable as he listened to Vasquez's pitch, his gaze moving to Amy with the dispassionate assessment of a man evaluating livestock at market. She lifted her chin and met his stare defiantly, determined not to show the terror that threatened to overwhelm her, refusing to give either man the satisfaction of seeing her break before the transaction was complete. The negotiation was brief, and conducted in a mixture of broken English and sign language that Amy couldn't follow, but she could read the body language well enough to know that money was changing hands. When it was over, she saw Vasquez nod with satisfaction and extend his hand to seal the deal like any other business transaction. Gold changed hands, more gold than Amy had ever seen, and just like that, her ownership transferred from one dangerous man to another with no more ceremony than if she had been a horse or rifle, Pleasure doing business with you, Chief, Vasquez said as he climbed back onto his horse, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had just made a substantial profit. She's educated and strong-willed, should provide plenty of entertainment. The casual cruelty of his words made Amy's stomach churn, but she forced herself to remain upright and defiant despite the fear that threatened to buckle her knees. Mato Tanka said nothing in response, but Amy saw something flicker in his eyes. Disapproval, perhaps, or anger at Vasquez's casual cruelty. As the trader and his men rode away, leaving her alone among the Sioux with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terror in her heart, Amy realized that her old life was truly over. Whatever happened next, she could never go back to being the naive girl who had believed her father would protect her from the world's cruelties. That girl had died in a deadwood saloon, sacrificed on the altar of her father's addiction and weakness, and whoever she became next would have to be strong enough to survive in a world where women were bought and sold like cattle. The silence that followed Vasquez's departure hung over the camp like smoke from a funeral pyre, broken only by the whisper of wind through buffalo grass and the distant sound of children playing near the river. Amy stood frozen in place, her wrists still, bearing rope burns from her bonds, as dozens of dark eyes studied her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She had expected immediate violence, perhaps torture or worse, but instead found herself facing something far more unnerving. Complete silence and the weight of judgment from an entire tribe who saw her as nothing more than a white woman's burden. Thrust upon them by circumstance, and Gold Chief Mato Tanka remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, his obsidian eyes studying Amy's face with the intensity of a hawk examining potential prey. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. But there was something else beneath the surface, a careful control that suggested depths she couldn't begin to fathom. "You will come with me," he said in English that was perfectly clear and unaccented, surprising Amy with its precision. "We have much to discuss about your place here, and the discussions will not be held before the entire tribe." His words carried no threat, but Amy heard the steel beneath them and knew that disobedience was not an option in this place where survival depended on understanding the unspoken rules of a culture completely foreign to her own. As they walked through the camp toward the largest teepee at its center, Amy became acutely aware of the stares that followed their progress. Warriors with painted faces and scarred chests watched her with expressions that ranged from contempt to dark amusement, while women ceased their work at cooking fires and hide-scraping frames to whisper among themselves in rapid Lakota that she couldn't understand but whose tone she could interpret easily enough. Children peered at her from behind their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with the kind of fascination reserved for exotic and potentially dangerous creatures. The camp was larger than she had realized from a distance, easily 300 people, maybe more, with horses grazing in vast herds beyond the outer ring of teepees and warriors standing guard at strategic points throughout the settlement. The chief's lodge was magnificent in a way that spoke of both wealth and power, decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols that told stories Amy couldn't read, but whose importance was unmistakable. Buffalo robes of the finest quality covered the ground, and weapons of war hung from the support poles like deadly ornaments, tomahawks with steel heads, bows made from horn and sinew that could drive an arrow through a man's chest at 100 yards, and lances decorated with eagle feathers that marked their owner as a warrior of exceptional skill and courage. But it was the man himself who commanded attention, not his possessions. Mato Tanka moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his every gesture controlled and purposeful, and Amy found herself studying his face for some clue about her fate. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward a pile of furs near the fire pit that dominated the center of the lodge. Amy hesitated for a moment, then lowered herself carefully to the indicated spot, acutely conscious of how every movement was being watched and evaluated. The chief settled across from her with the easy confidence of a man in his own domain. and for several long moments they studied each other in silence. Amy had expected brutality, perhaps immediate assault, but instead found herself facing a man whose intelligence was as sharp as any blade and whose self-control seemed absolute. When he finally spoke, his words cut through her preconceptions. Like a knife through silk, "The white man who brought you here believes he has sold me a prize. Tell me, white woman, what do you believe he has sold me?" The question caught Amy off guard, and she found herself struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't seal her fate before she understood what that fate might be. "I believe he sold you a burden," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "A problem he couldn't solve, and a debt he couldn't pay any other way." The words were bitter on her tongue, but they had the virtue of being honest, and she sensed that this man would see through any attempt at deception or manipulation. "I'm not a prize, Chief Matotanka. I'm a woman whose father valued cards more than blood, and whose only worth to men like Vasquez lies in what they can take from me." The admission cost her something, but she met his gaze without flinching, determined to face whatever came next with her dignity intact. Matotanka's expression didn't change, but Amy caught a flicker of something in his dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. "You speak honestly, which is more than most white people manage when their lives hang in the balance. The man who brought you spoke of your education, your ability to read and write. He also spoke of your defiance, as if it were a flaw rather than a strength." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Tell me, educated white woman, what do you know of my people? What stories have you heard about the Lakota, about Chief Matotanka?" His voice carried a challenge, and Amy realized she was being tested in ways she didn't fully understand. Amy took a deep breath, knowing that her answer might determine whether she lived or died in this place. "I know the stories they tell in Deadwood and other white settlements, that you're savages who take scalps and torture prisoners, that you raid supply trains and kill anyone who crosses your path. But I also know that stories told by frightened people are rarely the whole truth." She paused, searching his face for some indication of how her words were being received. "I know you speak English better than most of the men in Deadwood, which means you've had contact with the white world beyond warfare. And I know that a man who commands the loyalty of hundreds of warriors must possess intelligence and leadership, skills that the white world would rather not acknowledge." It was a gamble, speaking so directly, but Amy sensed that anything less than complete honesty would be seen as weakness. For the first time since they had entered the lodge, Matotanka's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The stories they tell about me in the white settlements are both true and false, as most stories are. Yes, I have killed white men, soldiers who came to drive my people from lands that were ours before their grandfathers were born, settlers who built their farms on graves of my ancestors, traders who poisoned my warriors with bad whiskey and cheated them with false weights. But I do not kill for pleasure, and I do not torture women or children." His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The man who brought you here believes he has purchased you a place in my bed, that I collect white women like some men collect horses. This is another story that is both true and false." Amy's blood chilled at his words, but she forced herself to remain steady, to show no fear even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "And which part is true, and which part is false?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't tremble despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had known this moment would come, had steeled herself for it during the long ride from Deadwood, but facing it now made her mouth go dry and her palms slick with sweat. Matotanka was quiet for so long that Amy began to wonder if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her more than any threat could have. "The true part is that I have taken white women before, 3 of them over the past 2 years. Captives from raids, women whose husbands or fathers had wronged my people. The false part is that I kept them for my own pleasure." He stood and moved to a wooden chest near the back of the lodge, returning with a small leather pouch that he placed on the ground between them. All three are alive and well, living with tribes to the north who needed wives for young warriors. They were treated with respect, given the choice to adapt to our ways or find other arrangements. None were harmed, none were forced. His eyes met hers again. But you are different from them. You were not taken in battle. You were sold like a horse or rifle. This changes things. The implications of his words hit Amy like a physical blow, and she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Changes things how? She whispered, afraid of the answer but needing to know. The leather pouch between them seemed to pulse with significance, and she found herself staring at it as if it might reveal her fate without forcing her to hear it. Spoken aloud, it means you have no honor debt to pay, no family crime to answer for. Your only crime was being born to a weak man who valued his own needs above his daughter's life. Mato Tanka's voice carried a note of disgust that Amy realized was directed not at her, but at her father. In Lakota culture, such a man would be stripped of his status and driven from the tribe. A father's first duty is to protect his children, even at the cost of his own life. Your father has failed in the most fundamental way a man can fail. He opened the leather pouch and poured its contents onto the ground between them, gold coins that gleamed in the firelight. This is what Vasquez paid for you. Blood money, purchased with your father's shame. Amy stared at the gold coins, each one representing a piece of her stolen freedom, and felt a rage so pure and hot that it burned away her fear. What happens to me now? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Do I become your property, like those women you sent north? Do I have a choice in my fate, or has that been taken away along with everything else? The questions burst from her like water from a broken dam, and she realized that she was no longer willing to wait passively for others to decide her. Future Mato Tanka gathered the coins and returned them to the pouch with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. You have choices, but they are limited by circumstances neither of us created. You can attempt to escape, though I should warn you that the nearest white settlement is 3 days' hard ride through country controlled by my warriors, and winter is coming fast. You can ask to be sent north to join the other white women, though that too carries risks and no guarantee of happiness. He paused, his dark eyes studying her face intently. Or you can stay here and find a place among my people, earn your keep, and your protection through useful work rather than other arrangements. And what useful work could a white woman possibly do for the Lakota? Amy asked, though she suspected she knew part of the answer. I can read and write, but I doubt that's much use to a warrior tribe. I can cook simple meals and mend clothes, but surely your women can do those things better than I could. She was thinking aloud now, trying to understand the strange dynamic that seemed to be developing between them. This was not the conversation she had expected to have with a Sioux war chief, and she found herself off balance in a way that was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. You underestimate the value of education in a world where the white man's ways increasingly intrude upon ours, Mato Tanka replied. Treaties are written in English, government officials speak only in their own tongue, and understanding their words exactly can mean the difference between peace and war. My people need someone who can read the white man's papers with the same skill they read tracks in the snow. He stood and moved to another part of the lodge, returning with a folded document that he placed before her. Read this aloud and tell me what it truly means, not what the white officials claimed it means. Amy picked up the document with trembling fingers, recognizing it immediately as a government treaty written in the formal language that was designed to confuse rather than clarify. As she read the dense legal prose aloud, translating the bureaucratic doublespeak into plain English, she saw understanding dawn in Mato Tanka's eyes, and with it, a cold fury that made her grateful to be under his protection rather than facing his wrath. This says that your people agree to relocate to a reservation that's 1/10 the size of your current territory, and that any member of the tribe found outside those boundaries can be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. It also says that the government reserves the right to reduce the size of the reservation further if circumstances require it. She looked up from the document to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. It's not a treaty, it's a trap dressed up in legal language. Exactly, Matotanka said, his voice tight with controlled anger. And this is why your education has value here. The white officials who brought this to us claimed it guaranteed our people's safety and prosperity. Now I know they were either fools or liars. He took the document from her and fed it to the fire, watching as the flames consumed the fraudulent promises. There will be other documents, other attempts to trick my people into signing away their freedom. Having someone who can read the truth behind their words could save lives. Amy felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation as she began to understand the role he was offering her. You want me to be your translator, your interpreter of the white man's deceptions, she said slowly. But that would make me valuable to you, and valuable prisoners are still prisoners. She met his gaze directly, determined to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. What guarantee do I have that I won't simply be trading one form of captivity for another? You have the guarantee of Lakota honor, Matotanka replied, and Amy heard the weight of absolute conviction in his words. I give you my word as a chief and a warrior that as long as you serve my people faithfully, you will be treated as one of them. Your person will be inviolate, your safety assured, and your contributions valued. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note of something Amy couldn't quite identify, sadness perhaps, or regret. But I cannot give you what you truly want, which is your old life back. That was stolen from you by men who cared nothing for your wishes or your worth. All I can offer is a chance to build something new, something meaningful, in a place where your skills are needed and respected. Before Amy could respond, the lodge flap rustled and a young warrior entered without announcement, speaking rapidly in Lakota while keeping his eyes fixed on the ground in a gesture of respect. Amy couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable, and she saw Matotanka's expression grow grim as he listened. When the warrior finished his report and left as quickly as he had come, the chief turned to Amy with an expression that made her stomach clench with dread. It seems your value to my people may be tested sooner than either of us expected, he said, his voice carrying a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Soldiers have been spotted 2 days' ride from here, a cavalry patrol flying the flag of truce and carrying papers they claim authorize them to negotiate for the return of white captives. His dark eyes bored into hers with laser intensity. They are undoubtedly here for you, which means someone in Deadwood has reported your presence among us. The question now is whether you will honor the arrangement we have just made, or whether you will see this as your chance to escape back to the white world that cast you out. Amy felt the weight of the moment, settling over her like a burial shroud, knowing that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of the entire tribe. The approaching soldiers represented everything she had lost: the safety of the familiar, the comfort of her own kind, the possibility of returning to a world where she understood the rules and customs. But they also represented the world that had failed to protect her, that had allowed her father to gamble away her freedom, that had produced men like Vasquez who bought and sold women like livestock. As she stared into Matotanka's eyes, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was being given a real choice about her future, not the illusion of choice, but the genuine opportunity to decide her own path. If I stay and help you deal with these soldiers, what happens when more come? She asked, her voice steady despite the momentous nature of the decision she was contemplating. What happens when the government decides that Chief Matotanka has become too much of a threat to their plans? Will you expect me to choose between my skin color and my loyalty to the people who gave me refuge? The questions cut to the heart of her dilemma, and she could see in his eyes that he understood the full complexity of what he was asking. Matotanka was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. More will come, of that there is no doubt. The white man's hunger for land and gold is insatiable, and my people stand between them and what they desire. There will be battles, possibly a war that will decide whether the Lakota survive as a free people or disappear into the reservations. Like so many other tribes. His voice grew softer, more personal. I cannot promise you that the path I offer will be easy or safe. I can only promise you that it will be honest and that your contributions will matter. The choice is yours, Amy Hartford, but it must be made now, before the soldiers arrive and complicate everything. Amy closed her eyes and thought of her father, broken and drunk in a Deadwood saloon, willing to trade his daughter's life for a chance to escape his debts. She thought of Vasquez, cold and calculating, seeing her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. She thought of the hollow-eyed women in his brothel, trapped in lives of degradation with no hope of escape. And then she opened her eyes and looked at the man sitting across from her, a warrior who commanded respect through strength and wisdom, who offered her work that mattered and protection that was backed by honor rather than fear. The soldiers can tell Deadwood that Amy Hartford died on the journey to your camp, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Tell them the white woman couldn't survive among the savage Indians, that she was too weak for this harsh land. Let my father live with the knowledge that his gambling killed his daughter. She met Matotanka's gaze directly, seeing approval flicker in his dark eyes. But the woman who lives here, who serves the Lakota people and helps them navigate the white man's deceptions, she will need a new name, a new identity. Amy Hartford was sold like livestock and died of shame. Whoever I become next will be someone stronger. Matotanka nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had met him, Amy saw something that might have been respect in his expression. Then welcome to the Lakota Nation, sister. Your new life begins when those soldiers ride away empty-handed, and may the spirits grant you the strength to build something worthy from the ashes of what was taken from you. The morning sun painted the black hills in shades of gold and crimson as Amy knelt beside the river, scrubbing buffalo hide with stones and lye soap under the watchful eyes of 3 Lakota women who had been assigned to teach her the essential skills of tribal life. Her hands were raw and bleeding from the unfamiliar work, her back ached from hours of bending over the rushing water, and her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to show weakness or ask for rest. 2 days had passed since her conversation with Chief Matotanka, 2 days in which she had thrown herself into learning everything she could about Lakota customs, language, and survival skills with a determination that bordered on desperation. The approaching cavalry patrol weighed on her mind like a storm cloud, and she knew that her actions in the coming hours would determine whether she lived or died as a free woman. Winona, the eldest of her teachers and the wife of a respected warrior, watched Amy's clumsy attempts at hide preparation with a mixture of amusement and grudging approval. You work like white women still, she said in heavily accented English, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as she demonstrated the proper technique. Too hard, too fast. You try to prove something that not need proving. She gestured toward Amy's bleeding knuckles with a click of her tongue. Lakota women work steady, like river flows. Strong but not foolish. You learn, or you hurt yourself for nothing. Despite the criticism, there was kindness in the older woman's voice, and Amy sensed that she was being accepted in small degrees by women who had every reason to view her with suspicion. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley like thunder, and Amy's blood turned to ice as she recognized the disciplined rhythm of cavalry horses approaching at a steady trot. The women around her froze, their hands stilling on their work as they listened to the sound that had meant death and displacement for so many of their people. Winona rose slowly, her face grave as she studied the dust cloud rising in the distance. "Soldiers, come," she said simply. "Chief will want to see you now. Remember what we taught you about standing like Lakota woman. Back straight, eyes forward, no fear showing." Her gnarled hand briefly touched Amy's shoulder in a gesture of support that meant more than any words could have. Amy followed Winona toward the center of the camp, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw warriors emerging from there. Lodges with weapons in hand and paint on their faces. Children were quickly ushered inside teepees while women gathered their most precious possessions, preparing for the possibility that this peaceful morning might end in violence and bloodshed. The transformation of the camp from a place of domestic tranquility to a fortress ready for war happened with a speed and efficiency that spoke of long practice, and Amy realized with crystal clarity that these people had lived under the constant threat of attack for longer than she could imagine. Chief Matotanka stood before his lodge dressed in full war regalia, his powerful frame draped in a war shirt decorated with scalp locks, and his face painted with the sacred symbols of his clan. Eagle feathers hung from his long black hair, and the morning sun glinted off the steel blade of the tomahawk hanging at his side. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Dark as midnight and hard as flint, they held the cold calculation of a warrior preparing for battle. When he saw Amy approaching, he gestured for her to stand beside him, and she felt the weight of every gaze in the camp upon her as she took her place at the chief's right hand. "The moment of truth arrives sooner than expected," Matotanka said quietly, his voice carrying only to her ears. "You spoke yesterday of becoming someone new, of letting Amy Hartford die so that another woman might live. Today we discover whether those were merely words or true intention." His dark eyes studied her face intently. "The soldiers who approach fly a flag of truce, but they come seeking you. How they leave this place will depend entirely on how well you can convince them that the woman they seek no longer exists. Are you prepared for what that might require?" The weight of his question settled over her like a burial shroud, and Amy realized that her performance in the next hour would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of everyone in the camp. The cavalry patrol crested the ridge overlooking the valley with military precision, their blue uniforms stark against the wilderness backdrop as they arranged themselves in formation before beginning their descent toward the camp. Amy counted 20 soldiers led by an officer whose bearing spoke of West Point training and Eastern refinement, men who had probably never seen a real Indian before being assigned to this godforsaken territory. Their horses were well fed and groomed, their equipment polished and regulation, and everything about them spoke of the organized might of the United States Army. But as they rode closer, Amy could see the tension in their faces, the way their hands rested near their weapons despite the flag of truce they carried. "Remember," Matotanka murmured as the soldiers approached within hailing distance, "you are no longer the frightened white woman who was brought here against her will. You are Lakota now, or you are nothing. There is no middle ground, no safety in hesitation." His words were like steel wrapped in silk, and Amy understood that he was offering her one final chance to reconsider her choice. But as she looked around the camp at the faces of the people who had begun to accept her, who had offered her a place and a purpose when her own kind had failed her, she felt her resolve harden like iron in a forge. The cavalry officer, a lean man with a carefully waxed mustache and the pale complexion of someone more accustomed to desk work than field duty, raised his hand to signal a halt just outside the camp's perimeter. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Blackwood of the 7th Cavalry," he called out in a voice that carried the authority of the United States government. "I come under a flag of truce to speak with Chief Matotanka regarding a matter of mutual concern." His eyes swept over the assembled warriors with barely concealed disdain, and Amy could see that he viewed the Lakota as obstacles to be managed rather than people to be respected. Matotanka stepped forward with the fluid grace of A predator, his war-painted face impassive as he studied the soldiers arrayed before him. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise, each word carefully chosen to convey both intelligence and controlled power. I am Mato Tanka, war chief of these people. You may speak your business, Blue Coat, but choose your words carefully. My warriors have little patience for white men who come armed to a peaceful camp. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Amy saw several soldiers shift nervously in their saddles as they realized they were vastly outnumbered and far from any reinforcement. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood dismounted with practiced military bearing, though Amy noticed that his hand never strayed far from his sidearm. I come seeking information about a white woman named Amelia Hartford, believed to have been taken by members of your tribe several days ago. She is the daughter of a respected citizen of Deadwood, and her return is a matter of considerable importance to the territorial government. His voice carried the entitled arrogance of a man accustomed to having his demands met without question. I'm prepared to offer substantial compensation for her safe return, and to overlook any irregularities in how she came to be in your possession. Amy felt her heart skip a beat as she heard her name spoken aloud, but she forced her expression to remain neutral, as she had been taught. Winona had drilled her on the importance of maintaining a mask of indifference, of showing no reaction that might betray her true identity. But inside, her mind raced as she wondered who had reported her presence to the authorities. Had her father grown a backbone and demanded her return? Had Vasquez decided to cover his tracks by reporting her as kidnapped rather than sold? Or had some witness seen the transaction and reported it to the military? The answer mattered less than the fact that these soldiers were here, armed and determined, seeking the woman she had decided to stop being. Mato Tanka's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker, but Amy caught the subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man preparing for violence. Many white women pass through our territory, he said with apparent indifference. Some as captives taken in warfare, others as traders or travelers seeking safe passage. You speak of one particular woman as if she were more important than the others. Why should the daughter of one white man matter more to me than the daughters of my own people who have been taken by white soldiers? The question carried layers of meaning, and Amy realized that the chief was probing for information about how much the soldiers actually knew, because this particular woman was illegally seized from United States territory and brought here against her will. Blackwood replied, his voice growing harder as he sensed resistance. The territorial governor has authorized me to use whatever means necessary to secure her return, including the application of military force if peaceful negotiation fails. His hand moved to rest openly on his pistol butt, and Amy saw the soldiers behind him shift into more aggressive positions. I would prefer to resolve this matter without bloodshed, Chief, but make no mistake, I will have that woman back, one way or another. The silence that followed was electric with tension, broken only by the sound of wind through grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Amy could feel the weight of decision pressing down upon her like a physical force, knowing that her next actions would determine whether blood was shed this day. She thought of the hollow-eyed women in Vasquez's brothel, of her father's drunken betrayal, of the life of degradation and despair that awaited her if she returned to the white world. Then she thought of Winona's patient teaching, of the respect she had seen in Mato Tanka's eyes, of the possibility of building something meaningful from the wreckage of her old life. You seek someone who no longer exists, Amy said, stepping forward to address the soldiers directly in a voice that carried across the camp like a bell. Every eye turned to her as she moved with the measured grace that Winona had taught her, her posture straight and proud despite the hammering of her heart. The white woman you described died 3 days ago, unable to survive the harsh realities of life among the Lakota. Her body was given to the wolves, as is proper for those who lack the strength to adapt to our ways. The lies flowed from her lips like water, each word carefully chosen to create the narrative that would protect both herself and the tribe that had given her sanctuary. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied her face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle. "And you are?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Amy could see him taking in her appearance, the Lakota dress she wore, the way her hair had been braided with feathers and beads, the subtle changes in her posture and expression that marked her transformation from frightened captive to willing participant in tribal life. But there was something in his gaze that made her blood run cold, a recognition that suggested her disguise might not be as complete as she had hoped. "I am Winyan Waste," Amy replied, using the Lakota name that Winona had given her the previous evening. "Good woman in your tongue. I have lived among the Lakota for many seasons, serving as interpreter when your people come with their papers and their false promises." She gestured toward the document that Matotanka had shown her 2 days earlier. "I read the words you write, and I tell my people what those words truly mean behind their white man's tricks." The roll felt strange on her tongue, but she could see uncertainty flickering in Blackwood's eyes as he tried to reconcile her obvious white features with her perfect command of Lakota customs. "Convenient," Blackwood said dryly, his hand tightening on his pistol. "A white woman living among the savages who just happens to have witnessed the death of the exact person I'm seeking. You'll forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." He took a step closer, his pale eyes boring into hers with laser intensity. "Perhaps you would be willing to accompany me back to Deadwood so that we can verify your story with witnesses who knew Miss Hartford personally. I'm sure her father would be very interested to hear your account of his daughter's tragic demise." Amy felt ice water flowing through her veins as she realized that her carefully constructed story was crumbling under the weight of Blackwood's suspicion. The mention of her father hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. But then she remembered Winona's teachings about inner strength, about the power that came from knowing one's true place in the world, and she found the steel she needed to continue her deception. "My place is here, among my people," she said, with quiet dignity. "I have no interest in visiting your settlements or speaking to white men who trade their daughters like livestock. If you doubt my word, that is your choice, but I will not leave this place to satisfy your suspicions." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with 20 armed soldiers facing a camp full of warriors who were equally prepared for violence. Amy could feel the weight of history pressing down upon this moment, knowing that decisions made here might echo through the years like ripples on still water. She thought of all the ways this confrontation could end, with bloodshed that would justify further military action against the Lakota, with her capture and return to a life of degradation in Deadwood, or with the slim possibility that her deception might hold long enough for the soldiers to withdraw empty-handed. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood studied her for what felt like an eternity, his military mind clearly weighing the costs and benefits of pressing his investigation further. Finally, he stepped back with obvious reluctance, his hand moving away from his weapon in a gesture that seemed to deflate the tension in the air like air escaping from a punctured balloon. "Very well," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But I want it clearly understood that the United States Army will be watching this camp closely. Any further incidents involving white captives will be met with swift and decisive action." He turned toward his horse, then paused to deliver one final warning. "And if I discover that you have lied to me today, Winyan Waste, I will return with enough soldiers to level this entire valley." As the cavalry patrol rode away in a cloud of dust and bruised pride, Amy felt her legs begin to tremble with the reaction to the stress and fear she had been holding at bay. She had faced down the combined might of the United States Army and emerged victorious, but the cost of that victory was just beginning to sink in. There could be no going back now, no return to the white world even if she changed her mind. She had burned that bridge as surely as if she had put a torch to it, and whatever the future held, She would face it as a member of the Lakota nation. Tanka placed a strong hand on her shoulder, and when she looked up into his dark eyes, she saw approval there, and something else that made her heart skip a beat. "You have proven yourself this day, Winyan Waste," he said, using her new name with the gravity of a man conferring a sacred title. "You faced the enemy of our people and turned him away with nothing but words and courage. This is the kind of strength that builds nations and protects the innocent." His fingers tightened slightly on her shoulder. "But you should know that there will be consequences for what you have done today. The white world will not easily accept the loss of one of their own, especially to the Lakota. They will return, perhaps with more soldiers, perhaps with different demands. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a sacred fire, and Amy realized that her journey from captive to defender had only just begun. 3 weeks had passed since the cavalry's departure, and Amy had begun to believe that her deception might hold indefinitely when the lookout spotted a lone rider approaching the camp under a white flag of truce. Unlike the military precision of the soldiers who had come before, this rider moved with the unsteady gait of a man more accustomed to saloon floors than saddle leather, and even from a distance, Amy could see the familiar slouch of shoulders she had once looked to for protection and guidance. Her blood turned to ice as recognition dawned. Thomas Hartford had come for his daughter, arriving like a ghost from a past she had worked so hard to bury beneath layers of Lakota custom and newfound purpose. Amy stood frozen beside the stream, where she had been gathering medicinal roots with Winona, her hands still dirty from their work among the healing plants that the older woman had been teaching her to identify and prepare. The knowledge had come easily to her, perhaps because it represented hope in a way that nothing in her old life ever had. The power to heal rather than simply endure, to help rather than merely survive. But now, watching her father's familiar form swaying in the saddle as his horse picked its way down the valley slope, all of that hard-won peace seemed to crumble like sand between her fingers. She had become Winyan Waste in every way that mattered, had earned the respect of the tribal women and the protection of their warriors. But one look at Thomas Hartford's broken figure threatened to drag her back into the shame and helplessness of Amy Hartford. "Your white father comes seeking his lost daughter," Winona observed quietly, her weathered hands continuing their methodical work as if the arrival of armed white men was merely another task to be managed with patience and wisdom. "But the daughter he seeks lives no more among us. You have become something new, something stronger. Do not let his weakness make you weak again." The old woman's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen many seasons of change and loss, who understood that survival sometimes required the complete abandonment of what came before. Her words were meant as comfort, but Amy heard the underlying warning that the choice she had made could not be unmade simply because it had become inconvenient or painful. Tanka appeared at Amy's side with the silent grace that marked all his movements, his dark eyes studying the approaching rider with the calculation of a warrior assessing potential threats. He had exchanged his war paint for the simple dress of a camp leader, but there was no mistaking the coiled power in his frame or the intelligence that burned in his gaze like a steady flame. "He comes alone and unarmed," he observed, his voice carrying no particular emotion. "This suggests either great courage or great desperation. In my experience, desperate men are often more dangerous than brave ones because they have nothing left to lose." His hand rested casually on the knife at his belt, and Amy realized that despite the peaceful appearance of the moment, the chief was prepared for violence if it became necessary. Thomas Hartford reined in his tired horse at the edge of the camp with the clumsy movements of a man who had never been comfortable in the saddle, his pale face already slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. 3 weeks in the wilderness had not been kind to him. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, his eyes were sunken and wild, and his hands shook with more than just the effects of withdrawal from whiskey. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with demons and losing, and Amy felt an unwelcome stab of pity for the broken creature who had once been her protector and provider. But pity, she reminded herself, was a luxury she could not afford when so much depended on maintaining the fiction that Amy Hartford was dead. "I've come for my daughter," Thomas called out in a voice cracked with desperation and what might have been tears. "I know she's here. I've been tracking rumors and stories for weeks, following every lead, bribing every scout I could find. Amy Hartford is alive, and I've come to take her home where she belongs." His words carried across the camp like a cry of pain, and Amy saw the assembled Lakota watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. Here was proof of everything they had been taught about white men: that they were weak, that they abandoned their responsibilities, that they could not be trusted to protect what mattered most. Motto. Tonka stepped forward with the measured pace of a man who controlled every aspect of his environment, his presence commanding attention, without the need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority, tempered by careful diplomacy. "You seek someone who no longer exists in this place," he said in perfect English that seemed to surprise Thomas with its precision. "The white woman you described died many days ago, unable to adapt to our ways. Her body was given to the elements as our custom demands. There is nothing here for you to reclaim." The lie flowed from his lips with the ease of absolute conviction, and Amy marveled at how completely he had embraced her deception as his own Thomas Hartford's face crumpled with anguish. But instead of the grief Amy had expected, she saw something else in his expression, a stubborn refusal to accept what he was being told. "No," he said, shaking his head with the vigor of a man denying an unpalatable truth. "No, that's not possible. Amy is strong, stronger than I ever gave her credit for. She wouldn't just give up and die. She's here somewhere, and I'm not leaving without her." His eyes swept over the camp with desperate intensity, and Amy felt her stomach clench with dread as his gaze passed over her without recognition. The Lakota clothes, the darkened skin from weeks of outdoor work, the subtle changes in her posture and bearing, all of it combined to render her invisible to the man who had raised her. "Your grief makes you deaf to truth," Mato Tonka replied with something that might have been sympathy. "But truth does not change because we refuse to hear it. The woman you seek is gone, and your presence here brings danger to my people. I suggest you return to your white settlements and mourn your daughter properly, rather than chasing shadows in the wilderness." The dismissal was polite, but final, and Amy could see the warriors around the camp preparing to enforce their chief's words, if necessary. But instead of deterring Thomas, the threat seemed to ignite something desperate and dangerous in his eyes. "I'll offer you anything," Thomas said, his voice rising to a desperate pitch that made Amy's heart ache despite everything he had done. To her, gold, horses, weapons, whatever you want in exchange for my daughter's return. "I know I failed her, know I don't deserve her forgiveness, but she's all I have left in this world. Please, I'm begging you, just let me see her. Let me try to make this right." The words poured from him like blood from a wound, and Amy felt the careful walls she had built around her emotions beginning to crack under the assault of his obvious anguish. Amy found herself taking an involuntary step forward, some deep instinct responding to her father's pain despite the rational knowledge that revealing herself would destroy everything she had worked to build. But Winona's gnarled hand closed around her wrist with surprising strength, holding her in place while the old woman shook her head in warning. "White father's tears are poison," she whispered in heavily accented English. "They make you forget why you chose to be strong. Remember what he traded you for. Remember what waits for you in white man's world if you go back." The words hit Amy like cold water, washing away the momentary weakness and restoring her sense of purpose. Mato Tonka's expression had grown harder as he listened to Thomas's increasingly desperate pleas, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of steel that made several horses shift nervously. "You speak of making things right, but some wrongs cannot be undone by tears or gold. A man who trades his daughter's freedom for gambling debts has forfeited the right to call himself a father. There's nothing here for you, and your continued presence endangers people who have done you no harm." He gestured toward the camp's perimeter, where armed warriors had begun to gather with expressions that suggested their patience was wearing thin. "Leave now, while you still can, and do not return. This is the only warning you will receive." But Thomas Hartford was beyond rational thought, driven by guilt and desperation to the edge of madness. Instead of retreating, he slid down from his horse and took several stumbling steps toward the center of the camp, his wild eyes searching every face for some sign of recognition. "Amy," he called out, his voice breaking on her name. "Amy, I know you're here. Please, sweetheart, just let me see you. Let me apologize. Let me try to explain. I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I could win the money back. Thought I could fix everything before you ever had to know what I'd done." Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, and Amy felt her resolve wavering despite everything she knew about the futility of his promises. The camp had gone deadly silent, with every warrior's hand resting on his weapon as they waited for their chief's signal. Amy could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm, could sense that violence was only moments away if her father continued his desperate search. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of ordering his warriors to remove the intruder by force, Mato Tanka turned his dark gaze directly to Amy, and she saw in his eyes not command or expectation, but something far more dangerous, the offer of choice. He was giving her the opportunity to reveal herself if she chose, to step forward and reclaim her old identity despite everything it would cost. Amy felt the weight of that choice settling over her like a burial shroud, knowing that her next action would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of everyone in the camp. She thought of the hollow-eyed women in Vasquez's brothel, of the life of degradation and despair that awaited her in the white world. She thought of Winona's patient teaching, of the respect she had earned through weeks of hard work and dedication. Most of all, she thought of the man standing beside her, the warrior chief who had offered her protection without asking for payment, who had given her purpose without demanding submission, who had treated her as a person rather than property. "I am Winyan Waste," Amy said, stepping forward to address her father directly in a voice that carried across the silent camp like the toll of a funeral bell. "I serve the Lakota people as interpreter and healer. The white woman you seek no longer exists. She died the day her father traded her life for gambling debts." She met Thomas's eyes directly, seeing the moment of recognition dawn in his face like a sunrise. "Go back to Deadwood, Thomas Hartford. Mourn your daughter properly, and try to become the man she once believed you to be. But do not seek to reclaim what you yourself destroyed." Thomas Hartford staggered as if she had struck him, his face contorting with a mixture of relief, joy, and crushing despair. "Amy," he whispered, reaching out toward her with trembling hands. "Oh God, Amy, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry for what I did to you. Please come home with me. I'll protect you this time, I swear it. I'll never touch another card, never take another drink. We can start over somewhere new, somewhere clean." His voice broke completely on the last words, and Amy felt tears burning in her own eyes as she looked at the broken man who had once been her whole world. "There's no home for me in your world," Amy replied with gentle finality, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging in her chest. "You made sure of that when you staked my life on a hand of poker. The daughter you're mourning chose to die rather than return to the shame you created for her. Honor that choice, and let both of us find peace." She turned away from him then, moving to stand beside Mato Tanka with the fluid grace she had learned from weeks of Lakota training. Winyan Waste has found her place among people who value her for what she can give, not what can be taken from her. That is worth more than all the gold in Deadwood." Thomas Hartford stood frozen for a long moment, his outstretched hands slowly falling to his sides as the finality of her rejection sank in. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, carried on the morning wind. "I love you, Amy. Whatever name you choose to call yourself, whatever life you build here, I will always love you. And I will spend whatever days I have left trying to become worthy of the daughter I lost." He turned and walked back to his horse with the slow, careful movements of a man who had aged decades in the space of minutes. As he rode away without looking back, Amy felt something break inside her chest, not her resolve, but the last threads connecting her to a past that could never be reclaimed. The first snows of winter had begun to dust the peaks of the Black Hills when disaster struck the camp with the sudden ferocity of a prairie wildfire. Amy was grinding dried berries into winter stores when the cry went up from the eastern sentries, riders approaching fast, but these were not soldiers or traders. These were Lakota warriors from the Oglala band, their horses lathered with sweat and foam, their faces painted with the stark white symbols of mourning and revenge. The lead rider, a young brave named Hoka, slid from his exhausted mount and staggered toward Matu, Tanka's lodge, with news that would shatter the fragile peace the camp had enjoyed for months. "Spotted Tail is dead," Hoka gasped, his chest heaving. From the desperate ride that had brought him across 200 miles of hostile territory. Murdered by his own nephew, Crow Dog, in a dispute over treaty negotiations with the whites. "The agent demands blood payment, threatens to bring soldiers if we do not surrender Crow Dog for hanging." His words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows, and Amy saw faces that had learned to trust her transform with suspicion and rage. Spotted Tail had been more than just another chief. He had been the primary advocate for peaceful coexistence with the white settlers, the voice of moderation, in councils increasingly dominated by calls for war. His death meant that the delicate balance between the two worlds was about to collapse completely. Amy felt the weight of hostile stares pressing down upon her as word of the assassination spread through the camp like poison in a stream. She had spent months earning the trust of these people, proving her worth through hard work and dedication, but she could see that trust evaporating in the face of this new crisis. Whispered conversations in rapid Lakota swirled around her, too fast for her still developing language skills to follow completely. But she caught enough words to understand that some were questioning whether it was mere coincidence that violence had erupted so soon after a white woman had joined their band. The suspicion cut deeper than any physical wound, threatening to destroy everything she had worked to build in this place that had become her home. Mato Tanka emerged from his emergency council with the Oglala messengers wearing an expression that Amy had never seen before. Not anger or fear, but a profound sadness that seemed to age him years in the span of hours. When he spoke to the assembled tribe, his voice carried the weight of prophecy and the burden of impossible choices. "The peace that Spotted Tail died trying to preserve is broken beyond repair," he announced. "The white agent demands that we surrender Crow Dog to their justice, but our laws say that blood debt can only be paid according to our customs. If we refuse, the soldiers will come. If we comply, we become servants rather than free people." The stark simplicity of his words laid bare the trap that had been closing around all the Plains tribes for decades, the choice between cultural extinction and physical annihilation. "This is what comes of harboring white spies among us," declared Standing Bear, one of the tribe's most respected war leaders and a man who had never fully accepted Amy's presence in the camp. His scarred face, marked by a cavalry saber during the battle at Little Bighorn 3 months earlier, was twisted with contempt as he pointed directly at Amy. "She reads their papers, speaks their tongue, claims to serve our interests while her very presence draws their attention to our camp. How do we know she has not been sending messages to her white father, telling him of our movements and plans?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poison fire, and Amy felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. The silence that followed Standing Bear's challenge was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind through the camp and the distant crying of babies who sensed the tension in the adult voices around them. Amy felt every eye in the tribe upon her, measuring her worthiness, judging whether the white woman who had claimed to die and be reborn as Lakota could be trusted when the survival of the people hung in the balance. She understood that this was more than just an accusation. It was a test of everything she had claimed to become, a moment that would determine whether Winyan Waste was truly real or merely a convenient fiction that would be discarded when it became inconvenient. "I have never betrayed this tribe's secrets to any white person," Amy said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent camp as she stepped forward to face her accuser directly. "I turned away my own father when he came seeking me, chose to remain dead to the white world rather than reveal anything that might harm the people who gave me sanctuary. If my presence brings danger to this camp, I will leave tonight and never return. But I will not stand silent while my honor is questioned by someone who judges me by the color of my skin rather than the content of my actions." The words burned in her throat, but she forced them out with the strength that Winona had taught her to find in moments of crisis. Standing Bear's hand moved to his tomahawk, and for a moment Amy thought he might strike her down where she stood. But instead, he turned to address Mato Tanka with the formal respect due to a chief, though his voice still carried the edge of barely controlled anger. "This woman's words are wind," he declared. "She speaks of honor while Spotted Tail lies. Dead and soldiers mass on our borders. I say we should test her loyalty in the old way. Let her prove her commitment to our people by taking part in the revenge raid against Crow Dog's band. If she truly serves Lakota interests, let her spill white blood alongside our warriors." The challenge was like a gauntlet thrown at Amy's feet, and she realized with crystal clarity that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future of her relationship with the man who had become far more than just her. Protector Mato Tanka's dark eyes met Amy's across the circle of hostile faces, and she saw in them a complex mixture of emotions: concern for her safety, respect for her courage, and something deeper that made her heart skip a beat despite the deadly seriousness of the moment. When he spoke, his words were carefully measured, designed to navigate the treacherous currents of tribal politics, while protecting the woman who had become increasingly important to him. Standing Bear speaks from anger and grief, as is his right, but wisdom counsels against hasty action when the stakes are so high. The white woman has proven herself through months of faithful service. To demand that she prove herself through violence would be to lower ourselves to the level of those who judge worth only through bloodshed. His voice carried the authority of absolute leadership, but Amy could see the cost of defending her in the faces of warriors who had followed him into countless battles. Then let her prove herself another way. Standing Bear replied, his scarred face twisting with contempt. "The agent who demands Crow Dog's surrender will arrive within days to hear our answer. Let the white woman use her knowledge of their customs and language to negotiate a solution that preserves both our honor and our lives. If she truly possesses the skills she claims, let her demonstrate them when the stakes are highest. And if she fails..." He let the threat hang unspoken in the air, but its meaning was clear to everyone present. Amy felt the weight of the entire tribe's expectations settling upon her shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than anything she had ever carried. They were asking her to accomplish what seasoned diplomats and experienced chiefs had failed to achieve: finding a middle path between the irreconcilable demands of two cultures locked in mortal conflict. The task seemed impossible, but as she looked around the circle of faces watching her with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism, she realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for since the day she chose to become Winyan Waste. All of her study of white law and custom, all of her growing understanding of Lakota values and traditions, had led to this crucial test. I will negotiate with the agent, Amy said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was undertaking. But I will need the full authority of the tribal council behind me, and the promise that whatever agreement we reach will be honored by all members of this band. I cannot work miracles, but I can use my knowledge of both worlds to find a solution that preserves our dignity while avoiding a war that would destroy everything we hold dear. She looked directly at Standing Bear as she spoke, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. And when this crisis has passed, if anyone still questions my loyalty to this tribe, I will submit to whatever test they choose to impose. My life belongs to the Lakota now, and I will prove that truth through deeds rather than words. The council that followed stretched deep into the night, with voices raised in heated debate as the tribe struggled to find consensus on a course of action that could satisfy both their own sense of justice and the implacable demands of the white authorities. Amy sat beside Mato Tonka throughout the long hours of discussion, offering quiet counsel when asked, but mostly listening to the passionate arguments that revealed the deep divisions within the tribe about how to respond to this latest crisis. Some advocated immediate flight to Canada, where Sitting Bull had taken refuge after Little Bighorn. Others called for armed resistance, arguing that death in battle was preferable to slow strangulation under white law. But gradually, as the night wore on and exhaustion began to take its toll, a fragile consensus began to emerge around Amy's proposal to attempt negotiation when Agent Morrison arrived 3 days later with an escort of 20 heavily armed soldiers. He found the Lakota camp transformed into a fortress of calm determination. Amy had spent every waking hour preparing for this confrontation, studying every treaty and legal precedent she could remember, crafting arguments that might thread the needle between justice and survival. She had also worked closely with the tribal elders to understand the traditional Lakota approach to conflict resolution, seeking ways to honor their customs while accommodating white legal demands. The task had seemed impossible at first, but slowly, painfully, a strategy had emerged that might just work if she could convince Morrison to listen with an open mind. Agent Morrison was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who clearly viewed his assignment to deal with hostile Indians as both dangerous and distasteful. His pale eyes darted constantly between the armed warriors surrounding him and the white woman who stepped forward to serve as translator, his confusion evident as he tried to reconcile Amy's obvious European features with her complete adoption of Lakota dress and customs. I am here to receive the surrender of the murderer Crow Dog, he announced in a reedy voice that carried poorly in the open air. The territorial government demands justice for the assassination of Chief Spotted Tail, and that justice will be carried out according to American law. His words were clearly prepared in advance, delivered with the mechanical precision of a man following orders he didn't fully understand. Agent Morrison, Amy replied in perfect English that seemed to surprise him with its cultured accent. I am Winyan West, translator and advisor to Chief Mato Tonka. We understand your government's concern about this tragic event, and we share your desire to see justice done. However, we believe there may be a path forward that serves the interests of both our peoples while respecting the sovereignty that your own treaties have guaranteed to the Lakota Nation. She gestured toward a circle of robes that had been prepared for the formal negotiation. Will you hear our proposal before demanding compliance with orders that may not serve anyone's true interests? The invitation was delivered with the diplomatic courtesy she had learned from watching Mato Tonka deal with previous white officials. But underneath lay the steel of absolute determination. What followed was the most challenging negotiation of Amy's life, a delicate dance of legal precedent and cultural tradition that required her to think simultaneously in two completely different languages of justice and honor. She argued that Lakota tribal law recognized the legitimacy of Crow Dog's actions under their traditional code of blood vengeance, while acknowledging that white law saw only murder that demanded punishment. She proposed a solution that would satisfy both systems. Crow Dog would submit to trial in a federal court, but with the understanding that any sentence would be served in a special facility, where he could maintain his cultural and religious practices. In exchange, the Lakota would provide full cooperation with any investigation into the circumstances of Spotted Tail's death, ensuring that justice was seen to be done while preserving the dignity of all parties involved. The negotiation stretched through the entire day, with breaks for consultation on both sides, as Amy worked to convince skeptical Lakota warriors that compromise was not surrender, while simultaneously persuading Morrison that flexibility in enforcement might serve federal interests better than rigid adherence to protocol. By evening, exhausted but grimly determined, she had managed to craft an agreement that neither side loved but both could accept, a testament to the art of diplomacy that left everyone slightly dissatisfied, but willing to avoid the bloodshed that had seemed inevitable just hours before. As Agent Morrison and his escort rode away with Crow Dog as their prisoner, but also with guarantees of fair treatment that Amy had insisted upon, she felt a profound mixture of triumph and exhaustion wash over her. She had proven herself in the most demanding test possible, using her unique position between two worlds to preserve lives and honor on both sides. But more than that, she had finally, truly become Winyan Waste, not just in name or appearance, but in the deepest sense of serving her adopted people with skills that no one else possessed. The first blizzard of winter had blanketed the Black Hills in pristine white when Amy discovered that her transformation from broken captive to respected tribal member had accomplished something she had never dared hope for. She had captured the heart of the most powerful man in the territory. She learned of Matotanka's feelings not through words or grand gestures, but through the quiet testimony of Winona, who arrived at Amy's lodge one morning with knowing eyes and hands full of sacred white buffalo hide. "Chief has requested that this be made into wedding dress," the old woman announced with a smile that creased her weathered face into a map of joy and approval. "He says white woman who became Lakota in all ways, but blood deserves ceremony that honors both her courage and her new nation." Amy's hands trembled as she touched the impossibly soft hide, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. To her, white buffalo were sacred to the Lakota, their hides reserved for the most important ceremonies and the most honored members of the tribe. That Matotanka would choose such material for her wedding dress was more than romantic gesture. It was public declaration that he valued her not as exotic conquest or convenient political alliance, but as true partner worthy of the highest respect his culture could bestow. The weight of that recognition settled over her like warm blanket, washing away the last lingering doubts about whether she truly belonged in this world she had chosen. The wedding ceremony took place under the full moon of the winter solstice, with the entire tribe gathered around a great fire that painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Amy wore the white buffalo dress that Winona had crafted with painstaking care, its intricate beadwork telling the story of her journey from captive to cherished daughter of the Lakota nation. But it was Matotanka who took her breath away as he stood waiting for her beside the sacred fire, his powerful frame draped in ceremonial robes and his dark eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that spoke of love freely given rather than duty, reluctantly accepted, as they spoke their vows in both English and Lakota, pledging their lives to each other and to the tribe that had witnessed their unlikely love story. Amy felt the final pieces of her old identity falling away like autumn leaves. She was no longer the frightened girl whose father had traded her for gambling debts, no longer the desperate woman who had been sold like livestock to settle a debt she had never owed. She was Winyan Waste, beloved wife of Chief Matotanka, respected healer and negotiator, and living proof that love could grow in the most unlikely soil when tended by patient hands and faithful hearts. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with the entire camp joining in dances and songs that celebrated not just the union of two hearts, but the bridge that Amy represented between two worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. Warriors who had once viewed her with suspicion now sang her praises, recounting how her diplomatic skills had prevented bloodshed and her healing knowledge had saved lives. Children who had been taught to fear white people now gathered around her lodge to hear stories told in accented Lakota that grew stronger and more natural with each passing day on their wedding night. As Amy lay in her husband's arms, listening to the wind sing through the buffalo hide walls of their lodge, Mato Tanka spoke words that completed her transformation in ways that no ceremony or public recognition could have achieved. "You asked me once why I protected you when you were nothing but burden," he said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin that spoke of possession and protection in equal measure. "The truth is that I saw in you the same thing I saw in myself, someone who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. You were never burden, Winyan Waste. You were gift that I was wise enough to recognize and patient enough to unwrap. Spring came early that year, bringing with it news that would test their happiness in ways neither had anticipated. A messenger arrived from Deadwood with word that Thomas Hartford had died during the hard winter, found frozen in an alley behind the saloon where he had lost his daughter months before. But with his death came an unexpected legacy, a deed to land in California that he had won in his final poker game, along with a letter addressed to the daughter I failed but never stopped loving. Amy wept as she read her father's final words, his drunken scrawl somehow transformed into poetry by the weight of genuine remorse and unconditional love. "I know you chose to die rather than return to the shame I created," Thomas had written. "But if any part of Amy Hartford still lives in the woman you have become, know that her father's last act was one of love rather than selfishness. This land is yours by right of inheritance, free and clear of debt or obligation. Build something beautiful there, something that honors the strength you found when I failed to give it to you. You deserved a better father, but you became a better daughter than I ever deserved," the letter offered Amy a choice she had never expected to face, the opportunity to leave the Lakota world she had fought so hard to join and build anew. Life in California with resources enough to ensure comfort and security. For a moment, she imagined the possibilities. A ranch where she and Mato Tanka could raise children in safety, far from the endless conflicts between white and red that seemed destined to consume the Dakota territory. But as she looked around, the camp that had become her home, at the people who had accepted her as family, she realized that some choices were easier than others. "The land can wait," she told Mato Tanka as they discussed the unexpected inheritance by the light of their lodge fire. "My place is here, with you and with our people, for as long as they need the bridge I represent between two worlds. Someday, perhaps, when peace finally comes to this territory, we can consider what new life might be built in distant places. But not now, not while there is still work to be done here." Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and when her husband smiled his approval, Amy knew she had made the choice that honored both her past and her future. Years later, when the Indian Wars finally ended and the Lakota were forced onto reservations, despite all of Amy's diplomatic efforts, she and Mato Tanka would indeed travel to California to claim her father's final gift. There, on rolling hills, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, they would build a ranch that became sanctuary for displaced Native families and a school where Indian children could learn white ways without forgetting their own. But that is another story for another time. This story ends here in the lodge of Chief Mato Tanka, with a woman who had been sold like livestock discovering that she was worth more than all the gold in Deadwood, not because of what she could give to others, but because of what she had found within herself when everything else was stripped away.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.